To kick things off this year, we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is weather. And I would like to thank our Session 1 sponsor, Anaheim Public Utilities. Weather forecasting is nothing new, but recent advancements in forecasting are adding stormwater capture and flood control efforts. From Lake Mendocino to Prado Dam right here in Southern California, improved water and weather forecasts allow for more effective management of reservoirs.
We've been working with the Corps of Engineers to be able to store more water behind Prado Dam during heavy rains.
Fyro has proven to not only preserve water, but it can also enhance flood risk management, which makes it a true win-win solution. This effort represents what happens when people and organizations collaborate and use science and data.
We developed a program to try to test it out. The motivation was because a drought a few years ago had hit. We discovered atmospheric rivers are the type of storm that causes the flooding and provides most of the water supply.
You know, we need to balance water supply with flood protection. And Fyro has given us a structure for an unprecedented level of collaboration. And we've been able to demonstrate that using forecast information, we can store more water than we would have otherwise, and we can do it safely.
All righty, I'm joined today by a panel of experts who are ready to discuss Forecast Informed Reservoir Operations. Dr. Marty Ralph, who is Director of Western Weather and Water Extremes at Scripps Institute of Oceanography. Also David Van Dorpe, who is Deputy District Director of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Los Angeles District, and Grant Davis, who is General Manager of Sonoma Water. Gentlemen, here we are. Give them a round of applause, folks. Thank you so much for being here, gents. Looking forward to talking to you. My first question for all three of you is, can you briefly tell us about you and your agency's role in forecast-informed reservoir operations?
Good morning. I'm Grant Davis, the General Manager of Sonoma Water, and I'm really delighted to be here. Suffering a little bit from last night's close playoff game, so forgive me. Enemy territory. But Sonoma Water was lucky enough to hook up with Dr. Ralph, who you'll hear from in a moment, and the Army Corps of Engineers. We're a wholesale water producer that co-manages two reservoirs up in Sonoma County, Lake Mendocino, who you'll hear more about, and Lake Sonoma. And so it's the smaller of the reservoirs that's currently at the lowest it's ever been on record, Lake Sonoma. And the beginning of this effort goes back to about 2012, 2013, in which we received atmospheric rivers that came in, and the story is that we had to release the amount of water. The rule curve required it. The Corps had no other option. But we lost about 25,000 acre-feet of water, which is more than half that we deliver in a year. So today we'll talk briefly about how we got to be there and the partnerships that were required to do that.
Dr. Marty?
Hi, Marty Ralph here. I'm a research meteorologist. I run the Center for Western Weather and Water Extremes and started it a few years ago because it seemed to me in the weather business, I came from NOAA 20 years before that, or 20 years in NOAA, and it seemed the West was really under the gun with the risks of too much rain or too little, and the weather business was paying a lot of attention to some other problems and not quite enough to the Western water problems. So starting this center really was intended to explore the possibility that atmospheric river storms could be predictable enough to support water decisions in ways that hadn't been possible before broadly. And that's when we teamed up with Sonoma Water Agency, Grant Davis and his chief engineer, Jay Jaspers, and the Army Corps of Engineers in the San Francisco Bay District to talk about that possibility. And from those initial conversations after the situation Grant described, we formulated the concept of forecast-informed reservoir operations, and we'll be talking about that here today.
Awesome. David?
Well, I think we're involved because we're standing on the shoulders of giants, and that's the thousands of people that built our water infrastructure in the state, whether it was an agency like the Corps of Engineers, the Bureau, or a local agency. So we are a dam owner and operator. We're really involved in Fyro to find out how can we better use our reservoirs How can we better use our facilities to look at beyond flood control? What else is there we can do? And of course, to get better at flood risk management. We own Prado, we operate Prado. We joined up in a partnership with our research laboratory out of Vicksburg, Mississippi, ERDIC, as some of you know. And so when Marty and team approached, we saw this as a great opportunity to expand our knowledge. And we're just happy on how this whole process has been going. It's actually been phenomenal.
Awesome. Marty, what recent advances have been made that have allowed for Fyro implementation?
Well, first and foremost is the understanding science developed that atmospheric river type storms are the real rainmakers. Most of us in California or the West Coast are familiar with Pineapple Express storms, and those are essentially one flavor of atmospheric river. Atmospheric rivers occur all over the world, including the Atlantic and the Pacific and the Southern Oceans, and they're really vital to the global water system, global water supply and precipitation. So that's like the fundamental advance that was made. And then when we began to understand how important those storms were to water operations, we started to look carefully at how well we predict them, and we quantified how accurate the forecasts need to be to allow possible Fyro operations. And that is a whole story in itself, but we've made a lot of advances on understanding and predicting ARs.
What piece of equipment, I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but this is a question I've had since my forecasting days. I'm emeritus now, but what new equipment advances allowed you to make more accurate predictions in that area?
Oh, that's a really good question. There's sort of three main things I'll emphasize. One is, first of all, that we are now collecting observations with weather reconnaissance aircraft over the Pacific Ocean in the winter ahead of these storms. Where they form up, we don't have the best observations from traditional means over the ocean to get the forecast right. So now we measure ARs very accurately with the very same aircraft that are used this time of year to help the nation deal with hurricanes. We've applied that to the AR problem offshore. We drop these little sensors out of the aircraft, and we use 3 of them at a time, 3 aircraft, and they just basically profile the atmospheric river, really nail where it is, how strong it is, and its position. And then in addition, we have data on shore that California Department of Water Resources has supported to measure what happens as the storm's coming ashore. So we know precisely when and where the ARs are hitting when they hit, so we can verify the forecast, we can look at short-term forecasting. And then the third piece of equipment is really the underpinning of our entire weather prediction business is weather prediction models. So computer models that are state-of-the-art, they push supercomputing to further and further levels of sophistication, and we plug those data and our knowledge of the ocean and the atmosphere into the model to predict the ARs. And we have now shown, through the advances our center has led in collaboration with many groups, that we now have a better prediction model for ARs, partly because of the better data and the better science.
I'm just going to draft on that question one more for you, Marty. The preliminary viability assessment for Prado Dam was just completed. What made that a success?
The main thing is the collaboration among the experts who run the dam, Orange County Water District's initiative and leadership, Army Corps of Engineers initiative, engagement and leadership, and openness to looking at conservation applications, water supply applications, and the focus of an incredible array of researchers. Weather prediction's a tough business. To improve it is tough. And Fritz, icon, I grew up somewhat in California, and it's tough to stand up and say, hey, it's going to do this or next.
To be a successful weather forecaster, you have to learn to suffer public humiliation gracefully.
Because he didn't have Fyro.
I know, but I got out before you guys started getting really good with Fyro.
Good. It's sort of funny you say that. One of the things in weather business, you do have to be able to accept and look carefully at your mistakes. Yeah. And that's part of where our partnership between research and forecasting operations works so well. You saw Alan Haynes in the quote there. He's the lead of the forecasting office that issues river forecasts for the state. And we are working very closely together to examine those cases where the forecast didn't work out so well. So it takes a lot of, ability to accept and examine those times that it doesn't go so well.
Awesome. David, how does Fyro help your work at Prado Dam as part of the Army Corps of Engineers?
Right, so as an operator of the dam, we follow our water control manual, and that basically says, you know, you reach a certain elevation of water behind the dam, that means you release so much water out. Well, what we're hoping to do is to get better reliability so that we can better control the amount of water behind the dam for two reasons. Number one is flood risk management, our primary mission. And so we want to understand when we have a storm come in, we collect the water, we want to know how long can we hold that water and how slow can we release it. But also, we got to make sure that we are ready for that next storm event once it's coming. So with Fyro, we're going to get more lead time to help us with that, right? Storms here are flashy. We want to make sure that we can get enough forewarning so we can make the right operating decisions. We're actually looking to adjust that water control manual. Working with Orange County Water District, we just completed a feasibility study that included both water conservation and ecosystem restoration. So look at it.
There it is.
I mean, what's not to love, you know? So here's a picture of Prado Dam, looking down at the dam from the basin side. The other aspect of this is water conservation. So we have been operating Prado for water conservation for some time. The study allows us to now hold water year-round. And so we are now trying to get an update to the water control manual to do a couple things, but one of them is to look at how we can now incorporate Fyro into the water control plan. So we're not purely looking at stream gauges and looking at the reservoir elevations. We want to have that predictability model so that we can make those good decisions up front.
And the primary responsibility of the Army Corps of Engineers is public safety. So Fyro, I don't want to put words in your mouth, I want you to explain this. Fyro gives you an opportunity to maybe warn the public about an impending something farther ahead of time than they might have been able to before.
Absolutely. I mean, in the unlikely event or the rare event that we have a major storm, you know, we can only release so much to the outlet before we have to use that spillway. And so if we ever got to that level event, which is, you know, one chance in 800 in a given year or so, you know, we want to have that kind of warning system in place to help our downstream and our upstream communities.
Awesome. Grant, Sonoma Water is a great success story. And talk about the Lake Mendocino piece of your success up there and how that happened.
Well, actually, what I'd like to do with that question is just acknowledge a few key people if I can, because success is a group effort. And in this case, beyond Marty's brilliance with his new center, you have to go back to a fellow named Steve Lamar, who I know is in the audience today. He's the president of ACWA right now with a couple more months left on his term. He was part of understanding how important this would be if we were able to pull off Fyro in Lake Mendocino, and introduced the idea to Mike Marcus, with head of Orange County Water District, who took a leadership role in exporting what you just heard David talk about in terms of learning from others. I really think Orange County was smart to come second in line, because we've had to learn all the mistakes before, and there weren't that many, but this is a highly collaborative effort. And then Greg Woodside is also one of Mike's key staff members who puts this together for Prado. So they took what we did up in Lake Mendocino, which essentially was to use Marty's wonderful calculations, get advanced information on what the precipitation was going to be. And I will just say, our whole effort in the West is about atmospheric rivers. And Marty can go in great detail about this, but we need to understand they are our form of extreme weather events, and they're underfunded. The research on atmospheric rivers is critical for us to be able to implement Fyro, not just in Lake Mendocino, where we saved 11,000 acre-feet last year, but transferring it to Prado and Yuba and elsewhere. So it's a highly collaborative, interdisciplinary exercise that's required in each individual reservoir to get it right.
Awesome. Can I just ask Dr. Marty another question about atmospheric rivers? This is so much fun for me to be able to talk to the experts. I should have done that a long time ago. I'd have had more credibility on television. But is our concentration on atmospheric rivers now, and is the intensity of atmospheric rivers now a product of our ability to recognize them more now, or is a bit of it the atmospheric rivers being exacerbated by climate change? Anything over the last 10 years or so?
Yeah, good question, Fritz, and thank you for that. Science, atmospheric rivers is basically a story of scientific exploration and discovery. And as we've come to measure the planet more fully using satellites and many other sensors over the last decades, we've come to recognize how the atmosphere is organized And there was an iconic new satellite system launched in the 80s and early 90s that measures atmospheric water vapor from space. And it showed these long filaments stretching from the tropics to the mid-latitudes, maybe 4 or 5 of them around the northern hemisphere at any one time. And first experiment I led with an aircraft, we went out and measured those carefully, and we could see that in one of those atmospheric rivers, if you sliced across it as if it were like a terrestrial river, it was transporting horizontally as much water as 25 Mississippi rivers. There's only 3 or 4 of these in the whole northern hemisphere at any one time, and if you add up the transport of water in those 3 or 4 ARs, it's 90 to 95% of all the horizontal water vapor transport in the mid-latitudes. They're literally rivers in the sky of water vapor, and it's a testament to the scientific method, the scientific process, the advances in technology that we've been able to discover that. Once we saw those, we realized the next study I led was to how does that relate to precipitation on the West Coast? The answer was pretty obvious. We were thinking it'd be big, but oh, it's bigger than we realized. They're responsible for about half of the annual precipitation in much of California, 30 to 50% across much of the West, and 85% of all flood damages in the western U.S. over the last 40 years in FEMA flood claims have been ARs. So we discovered all of this over the last 10 or 15 years, irrespective of climate change. Now what's happening is we're realizing climate change is going to affect ARs in a way that could make some of them bigger on occasion, and it may also make longer dry spells between them. And this situation is really bringing us to the point where we have to really advance the methods and prediction, the science underlying it, because the F in Forecast Informed Reservoir Operations is forecasting. And frankly, atmospheric river research puts the F in Fyro.
Right. And now the conventional wisdom is by the long-range forecasters that we're moving into a La Nina situation, which usually represents a drier than normal winter, particularly in the state of California. Does that also mean that we're likely to be less affected by atmospheric rivers during our typical winter storm pattern?
That's a really interesting question, and probably everybody here knows about El Nino and La Nina to a degree. Back in the 90s and early 2000s, it was a substantially useful predictor of whether it was going to be extra wet or dry in Southern California at least. Northern California is sort of on the cusp, the pivot point of a seesaw, where the northwest coast of the West Coast, the northwestern U.S. and southwest U.S. sort of pivot back and forth depending on El Nino, La Nina, and Northern California is sort of at the pivot point, so it wasn't as impactful there. But since then, we've seen, like in 2015, a super strong El Nino did not produce the heavy rains that we expect. One of the things that we believe is happening is that it really only takes a couple atmospheric river storms, the big ones in a given year, to swing from too dry to normal or even to too wet. So how conditions in the ocean impact the likelihood of getting strong ARs in a given region in a winter is an area of active research. El Nino, La Nina is part of the story, but there's clearly something else going on. And this is the part of the frontier in research right now, is to try to understand and explore that so that we can see, hopefully out a few weeks, with some confidence that it's going to be a wet week or a dry week based on ARs. And we're inventing those tools right now, and it's a big scientific challenge.
It's interesting, it really is. Here's a question for all three of you, and that is, what do you see going forward in the way of cooperation between your three groups to sort of make your job as forecasting the atmospheric river component of this more accurate? What do you see going forward? Do you see greater cooperation? How can the state, the federal government, and local municipalities get together and cooperate more to make your jobs easier?
Well, if I can,
Go ahead, Grant.
I'll take a stab and let my colleagues talk. Fortunately, we've had enough success with the prospects in Lake Mendocino demonstrating that we can both improve water supply and flood protection by working in collaboration with the Army Corps of Engineers, which, by the way, really important work being done at the Corps, and their leadership in this is instrumental to our success. So that relationship that Prado also has with regard to Orange County and the district here is really important. Governor Newsom and the leadership at the state, I would say, we were up, unfortunately, it was declaring a drought condition at Lake Mendocino earlier in the year around April. And fortunately, the recent budget included funding for taking this to the next level. So what's really required, when Marty says put the F in Fyro, and that is forecasting, I take the other extreme, which it's funding. And as I mentioned earlier, we aren't getting enough federal dollars right now to understand and propel the atmospheric river conditioning. So that's essential. We've got to get the research component and build the network. So I'm pleased to see that the state's supporting Orange County. They're looking at Yuba County and other areas to apply what we've learned with the science and the implementation and the proof in the pudding. So I think by working together more closely, we're going to build that network, and we're going to need to draw federal funding in to leverage those dollars at the state level.
Yeah, you bring up a great point, and it speaks to a lot of the problems we have in this country in getting something done now, which is a lack of political will. And do you think that the federal government isn't as generous with funds for this particular issue because people just aren't aware of it? They don't think it's as serious as it is. You also have climate change deniers and environmental issue deniers. It's probably a combination of all those things.
From my point of view, if you look at this, it's really proximity. You think about the nation's capital, they're going to be funding nor'easters, hurricanes, tornadoes, and as Marty mentioned earlier, atmospheric rivers are really a relatively new phenomenon, or our understanding of that. We're also on the West Coast. We're going to have to work together to be smarter and more capable and demonstrate the cost-benefit analysis, the safety provisions, and the new water supply. So from my point of view, it's proximity. How about you?
Marty, where do you think we are in the future? What do we have to look forward to?
Well, first of all, a qualifier, I'm an optimist by nature. I think we're heading in a really good direction on this work. The leadership of the Corps of Engineers, of Sonoma Water, Orange County Water District, our partners in Northern California, and frankly, the California Department of Water Resources has really stepped out on this. We have invented a method here that we can try out in different reservoirs around the state and around the country. One of the challenges is the expectations have become high that it's going to work everywhere and that, well, what we've done now is going to apply everywhere. Well, it's not really the way it is. Every reservoir is different. I think of them like people. Everyone has a different personality. So we've got a lot of work to do there, and I think that's one of the things is the level of effort required is going to go up. We're working as a team of people leading Fyro to figure out how to do that effectively and roll out a very preliminary assessment across many, many reservoirs where we'll hopefully reveal which ones really should be warranted a deep dive. These studies, they are done super rigorously. We do the hardcore hydrologic engineering, the meteorological analysis, the water resource management. We develop decision support tools. We test them rigorously in the systems that the Corps of Engineers uses for safety, and make sure we have a chance to try it out in the real world for a couple of years. So it's a few years effort, and we know there's a lot at stake, so we're taking it very seriously. I have to say, I believe that the federal agencies that we work with, the Army Corps of Engineers primarily, Carrie Talbot at ERDIC is the program manager for Fyro, super effective individual. We also have NOAA investing in airborne reconnaissance, the program I mentioned offshore, the U.S. Air Force as well. The Bureau of Reclamation is poking around on this in a way that there is in fact emerging support in D.C. for these efforts. And part of our goal is to make sure that they have the state-of-the-art information for their policy-making decisions, and the same is true in Sacramento. And thanks a lot to water agencies who are very active in communicating the needs for the water system to the elected officials so that they have the information they need to make the important decisions they do. The partnership between science and water community has been just the foundation of success in Fyro, and I see nothing but promise and hope for the future in this.
David, are you as optimistic as Marty is about the future for the collaboration?
Yes, and I'm going to answer it by talking about the past. So, 1993, Arizona, Painted Rock Dam. And at the time, we had back-to-back very large major storms. we were following our water control manual, but we had concerns from our downstream stakeholders, mostly agricultural community. So at the time, the district commander, Colonel, now retired Lieutenant General Van Antwerp, went out to Arizona and met with the farmers and heard from them. And they said, don't release the water. You're going to destroy our entire crop. Give us time to get our crop in. Colonel went back, talked to his engineers, contemplated it, prayed a lot on it, came back to the farmers and said, okay, I'm going to give you 7 days, and then we got to open the gates. So we did. Painted Rock Dam has an unlined emergency spillway. It's just rock, bare rock. The only thing that's concrete structural on there is a 3-foot by 3-foot sill that spans the 400-foot width. After the storm, we saw that that rock had eroded all the way back to that concrete sill, and the concrete sill was hanging in some areas. Wow. We almost lost that spillway. Another day, we probably would have lost it and a good portion of our reservoir. Would have devastated a lot more than farmland at that point. I want to get away from that. I want to get away to a weight that we can better predict what kind of storm events we have so that we can give proper warning. If it's evacuating communities, if it's letting communities stay. I don't know how General Van came up with 7 days, but you know, that worked barely. We need to get better at that. So I'm really happy to say in October we saw General Spellman, the current Chief of Engineers for the Corps. He released his strategic plan for research and development. And under the 10 different pillars, under one of them is supporting resilient communities, and Fyro is part of that plan. So that's going to Congress eventually here, and I'm hoping that will keep the money flowing just like an atmospheric river right into our program so that we can keep working on this. Eventually, we're going to get to a point, pilot studies are done, we'll get guidance implemented, and then we'll be able to adapt this not just at Prado, not just up at Mendocino, but we can look at all of our dams. Yeah. You know, we have 14 dams here in Southern California that are owned and operated by the Corps. I see watercom potential in many of those. So let's see what we can do to really tap into that, build up our water supply, and hopefully have a much wider future that we can benefit from.
Wow. Thank you so much, Chance. It was really interesting. We want to give our audience an opportunity to ask a couple of questions for our remaining 8 minutes plus. Does anybody have a question? If you do, wait for one of our assistants to show up with a microphone. We'd love to hear what you ask and direct it to a specific person. Anybody? That only means that we over-covered our topic.
You got a couple
Dr. Marty,
oh, there we go.
Yeah, Dr. Marty, you talked about forecasting. What is the current best time frames for forecasting, or most accurate, and what does it look like? What's your goal as far as a week, 2 weeks, a month? What are the time frames you're looking at?
Great question. So when we look at the forecasts, we tend to, like, let's say this winter we've got a storm potentially brewing out over the Pacific. This actually right now, this is happening. There's indications preliminary that about a week from now we could enter a wet period for at least Northern California, maybe not so much Southern California. How wet, we don't really know. It could miss entirely still because it's 7 days out. As that gets closer, say 3 or 4 days out, we start to get pretty confident that we know an AR might hit California, say northern versus southern. As we get to 2 or 3 days out, we're more confident it's going to be like Bay Area versus, you know, Santa Barbara or something. And as we get closer in time, even 1 day out, you know, we narrow it down to within 100 miles or so typically. ARs are typically 300-400 miles wide, so it's like shifting that band up and down the coast. The other thing that's really key is how long they're gonna, if it's gonna stall, that's a big forecast challenge, and sometimes they stall, and that's where we get the really heavy events. When we look farther out in time, we have tools that look out 16 days using the global weather prediction model called the GFS, run by the National Weather Service. We also use the European Center's model, and we start to see hints 10, 12 days out, but we're super skeptical that those are really going to happen. However, sometimes they do. So we see these events sometimes where even 2 weeks out there's a hint, and then we see it actually happen. And we're trying to figure out when should we trust those forecasts and when not. In addition, we're thinking in week 3, instead of worrying about which day an AR might hit, we're just starting to think about whether or not it'll be a wet week compared to normal for ARs that week. So we're not worried about the timing as much as is it an active week. Same for week 4. And we're working on stuff for weeks 5 and 6. The amount of skill we can see right now potentially in weeks 4, 5, and 6 is very small. But that's the challenge in science. We can improve upon that. I'm optimistic about it. The ocean conditions are really important in setting and influencing what happens in the atmosphere. So better observations in the oceans are part of the equation, and there are initiatives to pursue that as well. When we think of seasonal forecasts out to, say, 3 months or more, we look at the ocean primarily as the driver, and we try to see if their odds are tilted, wet or dry, with respect to ARs. So that's where we're at on the forecast lead time.
We have time for one more question. Sir?
Yes. What does the ridiculously...
Wait for the microphone, my friend. There it is right there.
How do you understand and what role does the ridiculously resilient ridge of high pressure play in blocking the storms, moving them? How do you understand all that?
Ridges in the atmosphere are regions of warm air that create high pressure at the surface and tend to be dry. The air is subsiding. So that's the dry part of the atmosphere, in the sense of where we're at in the mid-latitudes. The troughs, or low pressure areas, are where we get cooler air, more moisture, and the ARs actually form up in between them. What happens when a ridge sets up and stalls west of here and northwest of here is it appears to block atmospheric rivers from coming in from farther west. However, there are times when an AR will bore right through a ridge and end up producing a wet period for a few days. So the ridge and ARs are sort of two sides of the same coin in the weather business. If you've got a ridge, it's more likely it's going to be dry here. If you've got an AR, that's when we get wet. And when you get one, you typically don't have the other. And they're really, getting them both right is really key for our prediction.
We have time for one more brief question. Anybody on this side of the room? In order to get your buffet, you have to come up with a question. No? Do we have one? Yes. Oh, there we go.
Yes, being a pilot, I like the aircraft part of this. When the 3 aircraft go out, how many sensors do each one of them lay? And my second question is there any place that we can go online and see some of the data you're coming up with? Thank you.
Yeah, good question. And first of all, the website for our center, if you Google CW, the number 3E, too nerdy, nobody else has that website. Center for Western Weather and Water Extremes. You'll find links to the Atmospheric River Reconnaissance Program. We also have the background on Fyro. That's the home port, essentially, for our description of all the Fyro efforts that are underway and the basis for it. When we take the aircraft out, they carry these dropsons I mentioned, and the 2 C-130s from the Air Force, we typically drop 25 each, and from the NOAA aircraft, the G4, we typically drop 35. And that's because the G4 flies faster than the C-130, so it can cover more terrain. We've found, so in total, we're looking at somewhere on the order of 75 to 90 dropsons in a 6-hour period. That 6-hour period, all that data goes into a big bucket of data that drives the global weather prediction models run by the US, the Europeans, everywhere in the world, and they use that data extensively to improve the predictions.
Well, let's give our first group of guests a round of applause, folks. Dr. Marty Ralph, David Van Dorpe, and Grant Davis. Excellent job, gentlemen. Thank you so much.
That was great.
You have a nice job.
And we'd like to thank our sponsor for session 1, again, Anaheim Public Utilities. Give them a round of applause as well.